Hey kiddos, turns out you can just break into your local university's conference rooms whenever the libraries are closed. Anyways, I'm Ryan Hooper and today we'll be discussing a slumbering rant that I coughed up at 3 in the morning regarding population controls and a few methods that these have been accomplished. There are various forms of population controls. In fact, some of them are still commonly used. Divine birthright, all-seeing eye, reprisals, tortures, rebuilding hearts and minds, and topped off with the sprinkle of bribery. Might overwrite is a pastime that humanity still enjoys. You see, it's a very simple concept. Now, I'm sure I doubt I'm the outlier here, so I'm going to assume that most people don't want to die. Now, what if you offered someone who doesn't want to die to either join you or die? Now, personally, that seems like good convincing to me. Do you know who else tried this trick but failed horribly at it? That's right, Hernan Cortez of the Spanish conquest of the Yucatan. During his silly Yucatan adventure, this madman went to Tenochtitlan with 1,500 soldiers and however many natives, and decided that this city that's twice as big as the largest one he's ever seen in Spain was easy enough to take on. And so he went to conquering. In fact, he was partially right. The Aztecs didn't know what to make of the Spaniards at first, which allowed Cortez to get very close to the Aztec Tlaloani, uh, Montezuma. Now imagine their shock when they thought the Spaniards wouldn't be willing to kill Montezuma and that they didn't have the balls to do so. And imagine their shock when the Spanish actually did it. How did this go with the Spaniards? Well, well as you'd expect, really. The Aztecs went absolutely nanners and tried to murder Cortez and his friends. After a bit of tomfoolery later and abandoning a lot of his men to die, Cortez rode off in the sunset on another peaceful adventure, with a nice parting gift to smallpox behind, finishing the job for them. Basically, 1,500 men and some locals clapped back at 300,000 Aztecs warriors, with no real reason to actually start doing so. Next, at the chopping block, we had the Divine Rule, which was essentially one of the greatest gaslights in history. Basically, it was like this: you ever heard of this omnipotent being called God? You know how God is perfect and all knowing? Well, put me in charge? Well, are you going to say that God cannot make mistakes? Would make the mistake of putting someone who's incompetent like me in charge? Do you think you know more than God? Well, surprisingly, that trick actually worked, except for that one time in France and the British Magna Carta and the Americans accidentally divorcing King George and whatever that thing the Holy Roman Empire was. Now, not everyone really cares about divine rule or beating the crap out of their local neighbors, so their ruler can get more land. But you know what does get people's jimmies in a scuffle? That's right, money. What does everyone love? Money. And you know what kings have a lot of? Money. People are basically willing to prostitute their morals away with the right cause and enough coin. Sometimes people pay a lot of money, still you don't go out of their way to kill you. Such was the trick that the British General West used during the siege of Ghazni in the First Anglo-Afghan War to keep the Afghan tribes away from fighting in the fort. But we'll talk about more on that later. You may wonder what that tiny little European island is doing in the middle of Afghanistan. Well, it's simple. Britain and Russia tried developing this great game, and the plot was basically both empires were in the middle of a pissing challenge over who could control Central and South Asia. The British played India, and the Russians kind of played Afghanistan by using a doctrine of local warriors. Uh, the British the British played the local militia doctrine with a side bonus of British officers, which would provide a +1 hit and +1 to the armor, as well as a massive reinforcement boost. But in all seriousness, though, local soldiers were a lot better to use considering that they were more expendable compared to European soldiers due to the replacement time. I mean, when we think about it, what's more feasible? A several month long trek all the way back to England and back to get a few people, or a 2 day walk to the local village and ask for some locals to join? Britain found unity with the Sikh community as a result of this military advice, and by giving good advice to many Sikh soldiers, many were able to return home, and obviously families of said soldiers felt very indebted to this. Well, that was pretty good until the Sepoy Mutiny happened in 1857, which banned Sikh soldiers from fighting with British soldiers because it was a broken playstyle. But anyways, you may ask, how was the great game that Britain was able to convince these meat shields to fight? Well, it's simple. Britain offered Indian soldiers free land, and India owed a massive IOU letter. And by providing a classic trick of I help you, you help me, things went well until the British cut over half the budget for the Ghazali soldiers and after reaching Kabul. After which, things started to catch up for the British, and life went right downhill really quickly, which actually worked out. Now, after reaching Kandahar, the British forces were led to the fort of Ghazni, which was what I mentioned earlier when General Claude West bribed a lot of local Afghan chiefs to not provide assistance to Ghazni, which was very effective at the start. However, come fine winter, the Afghanistans discovered that you could just simply take bribes and break your promise. And such was the fate of Elphinstone's army, where 13 soldiers of his original 12,000 man army survived their retreat through Afghanistan. After the British gave the Afghans everything they demanded in return for safe passage while they were stuck in their little fort, the Afghans meant safe passage from them and not the local tribes. They never meant outside of Afghanistan. The British were starving, freezing, and slogging through goat trails, and those who brought their family along would have their families held at the mercy of the Afghanis, while they themselves had to cross the path into certain death. This is getting kind of depressing. Why don't we check on goings on the Caribbeans? I heard Haiti is going off pretty well this time. And never mind, there's having a battle royale down there. I mean, when you come to think about it, when you abuse your slaves to certain degrees and slaves get a little angry, well, there's going to be a lot of fighting. And whenever certain people have complete disagreements over each other, who'd have thought that would have happened? After successful slave results um, started to occur, a lot of the colonists decided to take up arms against them, resulting in them also being targeted against the slave owners as well. And to compensation for this, the French government decided that they needed to keep the colony from going broke. So they sent in French reinforcements. Unfortunately, these guys also took a lot of disease because they didn't do proper reconnaissance. And basically, in a nutshell, the Haitians really did not want to be bothered fighting so many of those troops for so much longer. So they decided to call it quits and decided to pay a bunch of money so that way the French soldiers would just kind of piss off. Now, life in Haiti was pretty hot, so why don't we move on to some cooler times? I think the Cold War might be a nice place to start. So, what exactly was the Cold War? Well, it was when the Europeans decided to start wilding out, and all that remained was two superpowers, and neither of which were in a situation to fight each other. The Soviet Union suffered 25 million losses, with another 25 made homeless and 6 million buildings destroyed, compared to that of the American 400,000 man losses. Despite the comparatively fewer losses the United States witnessed, the American people were exhausted from pretty much supplying half the Allied war machine. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get the point. Wartime rationing, while still filling the American war machine, took a very big toll on a lot of Americans, and they kind of wanted to be over with it. As well as other emerging powers were unable to follow suit on this new international power vacuum, such as the Chinese industrial centers, which were laid to ruins after becoming again a decade long battlefield. Japan, the mighty fleets and their massive armies, lost 40% of its urban population. India lost over 1 million of people to famine in 1943. England lost a quarter of its wealth in 5 years. Even the French lost a fifth of its buildings throughout the war. To put it rather bluntly, a politically blind individual could tell that it was time for new superpowers to emerge. Now, with that context out of the way, what really was the Cold War? And it was basically just two dogs barking through a fence, and neither one of them actually bite each other. The Soviets were combat ready and capable, and were filled with vengeance. The Americans were filled with anger, and though they did not possess as much of a presence as the Soviets did in Europe, they could outproduce anything the Soviets could with every single weapon. The American military leader decided that if technology could go so far as to strike America, then it was time for America to come to everyone else. By setting up naval bases and air bases across the globe with international flight status, they could strike whoever they wanted to. In addition, American intelligence would work overtime snuffing out anti American elements before they became powerful enough to strike the home front. To give you perspective on how powerful this was, a few essential bases in 1946 was Canada, Fiji Islands, New Zealand, Cuba, Greenland, Ecuador, France, Morocco, Senegal, Iceland, Liberia, Panama, Peru, and Azores. The Soviet Union, in turn, did not have the privilege of two oceans covering it, and nor did it have the same industrial capabilities, but it did have a massive army and a lot of land, perfect for nutritional warfare, and a population filled with resolve and determination to eradicate all their foes, assisted greatly by the mistreatment and brutal Axis occupation. Rather than use their allies as a speed bump like the Americans wanted to, the Soviet plan was to help rebuild their sphere of influence, re educate the people that Soviets were here to help, and communism was the new hip thing, provide paramilitary training, which of course is fun for kids and a communal activity, but also it really helps know that your new conscripts can read a map and swim. By giving the illusion of care, the Soviet Union Americans were able to help rebuild Europe and their allies and mold them into their own ideologies, so that not only do they feel indebted to help, but they also feel entitled to help. Because people across the Iron Curtain believe something exactly opposite of you, and they can't stay. You ever heard of that book, 1984, and you thought to yourself, man, it sure would be fun to have the government watch everything I do? Well, and you're in luck because that's exactly what this bill did. Now, there's this thing called the Patriot Act, and that's what this is all about. Want me to list off a few things on this bill? No? Too bad. Record searches allows government to look into your private activities held by third parties. Secret searches allowing the government to search your property without notice of the owner. Intelligence searches expands exceptions to the Fourth Amendment for the collection of foreign intelligence information. Trap and trace expands Fourth Amendment exception for spying, collecting address information of senders and receivers and the content. And ease of access of citizen records. How did the Americans react to this? Honestly, they didn't really do anything about it, except for trying VPNs, bypass government filters, using encrypted messaging platforms, encrypting their files, as well as reworking their SIM cards on their phones. But in general, people mostly just try to fly under the radar and joke about the phantom presence of their activities always being watched. Thank you for listening to my half-hearted speech. You are the big brother to my Oceana. I am truly grateful.